My name is Brielle Carter. I'm 30 years old, a brand publicist by profession and, according to my sister, an embarrassment to the family name. She didn't say it to my face. That would have required courage. No, I heard it through the thin curtain of an event tent at her company's 10th anniversary gala. I had driven 3 hours in pouring rain to surprise her, wearing the navy sheath dress I bought secondhand, hoping she'd smile when she saw me. Instead, I stood in the shadows and listened to her laugh as she told a group of her colleagues, "God, please don't let Brielle show up. She's so awkward and weird, such a try hard. She doesn't belong in rooms like this." It wasn't the first time she'd said something like that, but it was the first time I heard it so clearly, with her voice full of mockery, her tone sharp enough to cut bone. I stood there frozen, fingers tight around the ribbon of the box I'd brought her handwritten notes, photos of us as kids, a necklace engraved with, "For all the times you protected me," though the irony now makes me nauseous. I thought maybe, just maybe, we could be sisters again. But that night, I realized something hard and painful. Some people will never see you for who you really are, no matter how deeply you love them. I didn't cry, not at first. I drove home in silence, my body on autopilot, my heart clawing at itself like a caged animal. I've spent most of my life trying to earn a place at a table that was never built for me. And now? I'm done sitting quietly in the corner. But before I get to how I blew everything open on national TV, before I tell you how I exposed my sister's secrets to the entire country, I want you to know who I am. Not the version my family tells. Not the awkward try hard they laugh about behind closed doors. Just me, Brielle. Ende. I grew up in Lexington, Kentucky, in a red brick colonial house with shutters that always needed repainting. My parents, Martin and Denise Carter, were respectable. My dad ran an insurance firm. My mom taught English at the local high school. People in our neighborhood used words like well-bred and charming when they talked about us. But inside that house, the air was always tight with quiet tension. I was the second daughter. My sister, Camille, is 3 years older. Blonde, poised, frighteningly articulate even at 5. She was the kind of child who knew how to fold napkins into swans by age 8 and could recite Shakespeare by heart. My parents adored her. The world adored her. And then there was me. I had frizzy brown hair, crooked teeth, and an inconvenient imagination. I asked too many questions. I wore mismatched socks. I didn't make sense in their world of perfect lines and polished smiles. Camille once told me, "You're like one of those old TVs that never quite gets reception." I laughed then. I didn't understand what she meant until much later. I used to think if I just worked hard enough, I could earn my place. I got decent grades. I volunteered. I made birthday cards by hand, wrote long letters of appreciation to my parents and Camille even when they barely acknowledged them. I baked my dad's favorite lemon cake every year for his birthday, and he'd still say, "Camille makes it fluffier." By the time I turned 16, I had developed a talent for disappearing. I knew when to speak softly, when to step back, when to let Camille shine. She went to Yale. I went to community college, then transferred to the University of Louisville, where I majored in communications. I interned relentlessly, worked double shifts, and eventually landed a job in Chicago at a mid-tier PR firm. From there, I clawed my way up to become a brand publicist of the best in my division. I help companies tell their stories. Ironically, mine never mattered. I kept hoping, even as an adult, that maybe things would shift. That Camille might look at me one day and say, "Hey, I'm proud of you." But it never came. Instead, she rose through the ranks of New York's elite CEO of a luxury lifestyle brand, Vanity Fair feature, Forbes Under 35. Always with that same polished veneer, always spinning a story. Camille's version of me was always small, always off-screen. The quirky little sister, the one who meant well. But she didn't know the whole story. She didn't know that I'd been watching her for years, not out of jealousy, but out of hunger. Hunger for answers, for truth. And when I started digging, what I found changed everything. Let's just say, behind her perfect image, Camille had secrets. And I had proof. The kind of proof that could dismantle the pristine empire she built. And one day, I made the choice to stop hiding and start speaking. Loudly, publicly. And yes, in national television. Not because I wanted to hurt her, but because I needed to reclaim myself. So, if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if you've ever been dismissed, belittled, or made to feel like your presence was an inconvenience, this story is for you. Because sometimes, the black sheep doesn't stay silent. Sometimes, she learns to howl. The first crack in the illusion didn't come during some dramatic confrontation or shouting match. It arrived quietly, like most betrayals do, slipped in between polite smiles and casual silences, nestled inside the folds of family dinners and carefully worded texts that never said much, but always meant more than they appeared to on the surface. It was a rainy Sunday in March, the kind where the clouds don't just hover, they press, heavy and low, as if they're trying to push the world down with them. I was visiting my parents in Lexington, and Camille had flown in from New York for the weekend, supposedly to spend time with us, though she mostly hovered in the dining room, attached to her phone, her heels clacking against hardwood floors like she was rehearsing for a press conference. We were having brunch, the kind my mom used to pride herself on: scones, fruit bowls, egg soufflé, everything arranged with surgical precision on lace doilies. My dad had just launched into one of his usual monologues about the importance of staying relevant in a changing market. And I was halfway through sipping a mimosa I'd made too strong when I caught the look Camille gave me across the table. It was a flicker, no longer than a blink, pity mixed with mild annoyance, the way you'd look at a child who's just said something mildly inappropriate in front of guests. I knew that look. I'd seen it all my life. But what came next burned like acid through my chest. "Brielle," she said, placing her fork down delicately, like every movement was part of a performance. "How's the little agency going?" "Still working with." "What was it? Pet food startups and Instagram boutiques?" My mom gave a soft chuckle, the kind that tried to mask discomfort, and my dad didn't even look up from his coffee. I smiled politely, even though I could feel my skin tightening along my jaw. "Actually, we just landed a series campaign with a clean beauty brand. National rollout." I led the pitch. Camille tilted her head slightly, that perfect golden hair falling just right over her shoulder. "That's cute. Good for you." "Aubergine." She said it like I'd just learned to tie my shoes. And I felt it, something in my stomach twisting, something old and ugly and all too familiar. I'd come home to feel close to them, to feel seen, but as usual, I was the backdrop to Camille's spotlight, the commercial break in her main feature. But the real blow didn't land until the next evening. My parents had planned a small gathering to celebrate Camille's company reaching a new milestone: 10 years in business, expansion into European markets, all the gloss and glamour she brought with her like perfume. I wasn't really supposed to be there. I was invited, technically, but only after my mother reminded Camille to include me. That kind of invitation always comes with invisible asterisks. The event was held at a boutique venue downtown, all white walls and modern floral arrangements. Camille floated through the room like a queen, surveying her subjects, kissing cheeks, shaking hands, always smiling with her camera-ready expression. I stood by the drink table, clutching a flute of champagne I didn't want, trying not to feel out of place in a room filled with people who all looked like they knew each other and were all trying to forget they ever had a little sister named Brielle. At some point, I decided to leave. My heart wasn't in it, and my stomach was starting to feel tight again, but just as I turned toward the exit, I heard her voice. Clear, sharp, and loud enough to slice through the hum of conversation. "She's honestly exhausting," Camille was saying to a man in a gray suit, her business partner. "Maybe, I don't know. She always shows up like she's proving something, you know? It's embarrassing. I wish she'd just stop trying so hard." I didn't move. My feet rooted to the floor like they'd forgotten how to function. The man responded with a polite laugh, something noncommittal, and Camille added, "She's sweet, bless her heart. But she's not on my level. Never has been." The words didn't sting at first. They sliced slowly, carving through layers of old wounds I thought I'd healed. I stood there for a moment, then another. And then I turned and walked out into the night, the cold air snapping against my face like a slap I didn't see coming. I didn't cry in the car. I didn't scream or punch the steering wheel. I just sat there in the parking lot, engine off, hands clenched around the hem of my coat, listening to the faint sound of music drifting from the venue windows. I could still hear her voice. Still see the tilt of her head, the practiced shrug, the effortless way she diminished me with a single sentence. And I thought, maybe this is what rock bottom feels like, not a dramatic collapse, not a broken down sob in the rain, but a quiet moment when you realize someone you've loved your entire life doesn't love you back the same way. Not really. Not at all. The next day, I packed my things and drove back to Chicago in silence. I didn't tell my parents goodbye. I didn't text Camille. I didn't speak for hours. But inside, something was changing. It wasn't rage. Not yet. It was something quieter, more dangerous. A seed. I started going through old photo albums that week, not out of nostalgia, but to remind myself that I had been there, that I had existed in that family, even if no one remembered me properly. I flipped through images of birthday parties, vacations, Christmas mornings, always with Camille front and center, always with me just to the side, cropped at the edge, half-turned, out of focus. I found old letters I'd written to her, pages and pages of encouragement during her freshman year at Yale, cards I'd mailed when she got her first promotion. I realized she'd never once sent one back. And that was when I started thinking. About perception, about stories, about image. Camille had built a life on image, carefully crafted, perfectly maintained. But I knew things about her that didn't fit in her curated narrative. I knew about the stolen business concepts, the NDA her assistant had been forced to sign, the hush money paid to silence a former intern after a mental breakdown in Camille's office. Things no one else would dare say. Things Camille assumed I would never say. And maybe, once, she would have been right. But not anymore. I didn't decide to go public right away. That came later, after one more blow, after one more humiliation I'll get to soon. But the first conflict, the first moment, I understood how deeply my family had chosen their favorite daughter, and how easily they dismissed me was that night, standing in a room filled with applause for a woman who'd never once clapped for me. And once you see the truth that clearly, there's no going back. Only forward. And forward, for me, meant fire. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being surrounded by people who are supposed to love you and realizing, slowly, painfully, that their love has conditions, unspoken rules, silent expectations you were never told but were always being measured against. Like invisible weights pressing against your chest every time you walk into the same room and feel yourself slowly shrink without knowing why. After that night at Camille's gala, something shifted permanently inside me. I couldn't shake her words. They rang in my ears for days, echoing in the quiet moments between client meetings and morning coffees, in the middle of traffic lights and evening showers, coming back in waves that made my throat tighten and my stomach twist with something bitter and familiar. Embarrassing. Not on my level. Stop trying so hard. And the worst part wasn't that she said those things. The worst part was how little anyone cared that she did. A few days after I got back to Chicago, my mother called me. Her tone was light, breezy, the kind of voice she used when she was carefully avoiding anything real. She asked how work was, if I'd remembered to water the peace lily she'd given me 2 birthdays ago. And then casually mentioned that Camille was flying to Paris the following week for business, and wasn't it wonderful how far she'd come? I stayed quiet, just long enough for her to ask, "Are you still there?" "Yes," I said, and my voice came out flatter than I meant. "I'm here." She didn't ask how I was doing. She didn't mention the gala, or the fact that I left early without saying goodbye, or the way Camille had humiliated me in a room full of strangers. I could have been a ghost for all it mattered. So I asked her something I hadn't asked in years. "Mom," I said, "do you ever wonder how it feels to be left out of your own family?" There was a pause, just a beat too long. And then she laughed, the same way she always laughed when I got too serious. "Oh, honey," she said, "don't be dramatic. Camille's just under a lot of pressure." You know how she gets when she's stressed. And that was it. Just like that, everything I felt was brushed aside, swept under the rug where it could live with all the other things. We didn't talk about like how they always bought Camille 2 gifts for Christmas because she worked so hard, or how they rearranged the guest room into an office for her when she visited but gave me the couch when I came home, or how my father introduced me at dinner parties as our creative one, with that half smile that made it sound like a flaw instead of a feature. For most of my life, I tried to tell myself it wasn't intentional. That the missed calls and the forgotten birthdays and the way my parents' eyes always lit up a little brighter when Camille walked into the room, it was just life. It wasn't personal. But when you spend 30 years pushing your pain into the background to make everyone else comfortable, one day you wake up and realize you've disappeared altogether. I began to notice things I'd tried not to see before. How Camille's framed diploma hung in the living room, while mine sat in a dusty box in the basement. How my mother would repost every article featuring Camille's company but had never once acknowledged a feature about me in PR Monthly. How my father had invited Camille to speak at his firm's conference but forgot to even tell me it was happening. I was always the afterthought, the extra seat at the table, the second-hand story no one really wanted to hear. And the truth is, it hurt in a way I didn't know how to explain. It wasn't sharp or sudden, it was slow, steady, like a drip of water on stone. It wore me down over years, until even the way I breathed around them felt smaller. There was this one moment I keep going back to it years ago, when Camille was recovering from her appendix surgery and I flew out to New York on short notice to take care of her. I missed work, slept on her couch, cooked for her, held her hand when the meds made her nauseous. And one night, when I was cleaning up the kitchen, she looked at me and said, "I don't know what I'd do without you." I held onto that moment for years. I used it as proof. See? She loves me. She does care. But now, I can't help but wonder if she said it out of convenience, if it was just a line, something you say to the person holding your soup. Because since then, every time I've needed her, she's been nowhere. When I lost my job during COVID and texted her in tears, she replied 3 days later with, "That sucks, hope something comes up soon." When I got promoted to senior publicist last year, she didn't even respond to the message. And when I sent her a birthday gift handmade, personalized, she posted a picture of another gift from someone else with the caption, "Best sister ever." She wasn't talking about me. And I think the hardest part of all of this is not the exclusion, it's the silence. The way everyone pretends it's normal. The way I'm supposed to smile and show up and be grateful just to be invited. The way my parents never ask how it feels to be second place in a family that only had room for one winner. So, yeah, I'm hurt. But more than that, I'm tired. Tired of shrinking. Tired of swallowing my anger like it's my fault. Tired of pretending that being left out doesn't matter when it's been the quiet thread running through every year of my life. And deep down, something darker is waking up inside me, not rage, not yet, but something stronger than pain, something sharper than sadness. The need to be seen. Fully. Without apology. And if my family won't do it, then maybe the world will. You don't realize how many tiny cuts you've endured until one day someone brushes against you and you flinch, like you've been stabbed, and that's when you understand it wasn't one moment that broke you. It was the accumulation, the slow bleed, the way your own family keeps slicing you open with the edge of their indifference while calling it love. After the gala, after the brunch, after the phone call that left my stomach knotted for days, I tried God. I really tried to convince myself it wasn't as bad as it felt, that maybe I was overreacting, that maybe I was still that insecure little girl desperate for Camille's approval, reading too much into moments that weren't meant to hurt. But the truth has a funny way of surfacing when you stop trying to shove it back down. It started with the family group chat, the one my mom created years ago and lovingly named Carter Clan, as if the name alone could hold us together. At first, it was a thread filled with updates and silly memes and holiday plans, but somewhere along the way it became a platform for Camille's highlight reel. Every week, a new announcement. Camille's brand was featured on a podcast. Camille was invited to a private event in DC. Camille met someone from the Wall Street Journal. Each message from my mom or dad followed with heart emojis and phrases like, "So proud of you, sweetheart," or "You're amazing." And I'd chime in, small and hopeful, "Congrats, Camille. That's huge." Sometimes she'd react with a thumbs up. Sometimes, nothing at all. But what really broke me was the silence when I shared my own news. When I was selected to lead a crisis response campaign for a major national clienta campaign that ended up being nominated for an industry award, I posted about it in the group chat with genuine excitement, not expecting fireworks, just hoping for something. No response. Not from my dad. Not from my mom. Not even from Camille. Days passed. Messages kept rolling in, as if I hadn't said a word. My accomplishment disappeared under a gif of a dancing cat my mother posted 2 days later. It felt like being erased in real time. So I brought it up. Carefully, gently. I texted my mother separately. "Hey, did you see the campaign I mentioned? It meant a lot to me." She replied, "Oh, yes, sweetie, I saw it, just forgot to respond. You know how things get, love you." It was like someone patting your head while pushing you out of the frame. And then, there was the inheritance. I never cared about money, at least not in the way Camille did, but fairness? That mattered to me. Respect mattered. And when I found out that my parents had updated their will and made Camille the sole executor without even mentioning it to me, it felt like being locked out of a house I helped build. I only found out because I was at the house one weekend helping my dad with paperwork he needed me to scan some documents, and in the pile was a copy of the new will. I stared at it for a long time, the words blurring, the meaning clear. Why didn't anyone tell me? I asked my dad, voice low, barely more than a whisper. He looked up, startled, as if he hadn't realized I'd notice. "Oh, it was just easier this way. Camille knows the financial stuff better." I wanted to scream. "I work in branding and communication, Dad. I manage million-dollar contracts, lead negotiations, build crisis strategies. But Camille knows the financial stuff." I said nothing. I just nodded and left the room. My throat thick with unspoken words, my hands shaking from trying to hold in a lifetime of disappointment. That night, I sat in my childhood bedroom, the one that still had my old high school posters and the squeaky mattress, and I read that will from top to bottom like it was a letter addressed to someone else. Because it wasn't just about who got what. It was about trust. It was about who they believed mattered. Camille was named in every section: executor, decision maker, future trustee of any family accounts. I was mentioned once, under personal effects, listed vaguely as the recipient of sentimental belongings, at the executor's discretion. At her discretion, Camille would decide what I was allowed to keep from my own parents. And that night, for the first time, I felt a deep, cold fury settle into my bones, not the kind of anger that explodes, but the kind that smolders, that changes the shape of your breath, that whispers, "You deserve more than this. You deserve better." I called my mom the next day. I didn't yell. I didn't even ask why. I just said, "I saw the will." She was quiet for a moment before saying, "We just didn't want to overwhelm you with the details. Brielle, you've always been more sensitive." Oh, more sensitive. That phrase wrapped around my ribs like a steel cord, tightening with every beat of my heart. I realized in that moment how they saw me not as strong, not as capable, not as someone to trust with responsibility, but as emotional, dramatic, too much trouble. So they gave Camille the power. They always did. They gave her the spotlight, the praise, the benefit of the doubt. And me? They gave me silence. They gave me the couch at holidays and the leftover decisions and the empty space where love should have been. These weren't isolated incidents. They were a pattern, a legacy. A quiet, steady campaign to keep me small, to keep Camille first, to remind me again and again that no matter how far I climbed, I would always be beneath her in their eyes. And I started to wonder, what if I stopped trying to change that? What if, instead, I exposed it? What if I stopped playing the quiet sister, the nice daughter, the understanding one? What if I told the truth? All of it. There's a certain kind of ache that comes from wanting to be seen, not in the performative, spotlight-hungry way people often assume, but in the soft, soul-deep, human way that says, I exist. I matter. I'm here too. And when your own family refuses to give you that kind of recognition, when you've spent decades smiling through dismissals and staying quiet through cold shoulders, eventually, you start to believe maybe they're right. Maybe your worth is something you still have to prove. After reading the will and hearing the indifference in my mother's voice, I could have let the bitterness take over. I could have shut down completely and disappeared into my work, buried myself in deadlines and client meetings and the familiar rhythm of carefully crafted campaigns, but something inside me pushed back against the pull of invisibility, something that felt old and tired and brave at the same time, like a child standing up for herself long after everyone else stopped listening. So I started reaching out, again. Not to Camille. Not at first. I knew she wouldn't respond with anything real. But to my parents, to the people who still held the pieces of my identity in their hands, even if they didn't realize it. I invited them to see Menno, the version of me they'd constructed in their heads, the sensitive one, the emotional one, but the woman I had fought to become. I began sending them updates, not casual ones, not begging for approval, but professional recaps, like I would send a client. I shared photos of campaign launches I led, press releases I authored, a digital cover I helped land for a beauty client that hit over 1 million views in 48 hours. I sent articles I was quoted in, podcasts I guested on, newsletters that featured my strategic insight. Weeks passed. No response. I called once, gently asking if they'd seen any of it, and my mother replied, "Oh, I glanced at one, but it was all a bit technical for me." That's when I realized they didn't just overlook me, they'd made a decision, somewhere along the way, to stop trying to understand the life I'd built outside their orbit. But I kept going. Because somewhere deep down, I still believed that if I just worked hard enough, if I just showed them the right version of me, the right headline, the right moment, they'd finally say the words I had waited my whole life to hear. "We're proud of you, Brielle." So I pushed harder. I pitched a series to a local station about women in branding. I reached out to a podcast I admired and asked to guest host. I took on pro bono work for a nonprofit that supported women re-entering the workforce, pouring my heart into their campaign because I knew what it felt like to have to prove your value over and over again. And when I was featured in a regional magazine as a rising star in media strategy, I bought 2 extra copies, mailed them home with a note that read, "Just thought you might want to see what I've been up to." Nothing came back. Not a call. Not a text. Not even an acknowledgement. And that's when I realized this wasn't about merit, or achievement, or effort. It was about a decision they'd made long ago, that Camille was the one they would celebrate, and I was the one they would tolerate. Still, I kept trying. Because I'm not someone who gives up easily, and even when my heart feels bruised from the weight of rejection, some part of me keeps hoping that people can change, that families can heal, that maybe if I showed them the truth of who I was, honest, capable, determined, they'd finally let go of their assumptions. I started therapy that summer, quietly, without telling anyone. I didn't go because I was broken. I went because I was exhausted from pretending I wasn't hurt. And in those sessions, for the first time, I said out loud what I'd never dared whisper before. I'm tired of begging for love. I want to be enough without having to earn it. My therapist looked at me, kind and steady, and asked, "What would you do if you stopped trying to make them see you?" I didn't have an answer then. But the question haunted me. It followed me into boardrooms and through long walks in the park, into lonely Friday nights and moments when I looked in the mirror and tried to convince myself that being overlooked didn't matter. It mattered. It mattered more than I wanted to admit. It mattered because I still loved them, despite everything. It mattered because I had spent years building a version of myself I thought they'd respect, and they hadn't even looked long enough to notice. And the most painful part of all wasn't the silence. It was the realization that my life had become a performance for an audience that never clapped. So one day, I stopped. I stopped sending updates. I stopped reaching out. I stopped explaining my work like a child holding up a drawing for approval. I stopped twisting myself into smaller versions just to fit their idea of who I should be. And in that space, something new emerged, not bitterness, not apathy but clarity. I didn't need their permission to shine. I didn't need Camille to see me as worthy. I didn't need to keep climbing a ladder that was leaning against a wall I never chose. But I did need to tell the truth. Because truth is the first step toward healing, or, if not healing, then at least freedom. And I was ready for both. So when the opportunity came, when a producer from a new reality docuseries reached out to me through a friend of a friend, asking if I had a story worth telling, I didn't say no. I didn't hesitate. I just asked, how much truth are you willing to air? Because I had truth. And I was done hiding it. I didn't expect it to explode so quickly. I thought there would be time, space to ease into the truth, a few quiet conversations before the storm hit. But what I forgot is that people who rely on image don't tolerate disruption, and once you crack the mirror they've been polishing for years, they don't look at the truth, they look for someone to blame. The production team moved fast, faster than I imagined, and before I had time to second-guess or retreat into self-doubt, we were filming interviews, gathering documents, piecing together emails and texts and whispers I'd buried so deep, I wasn't even sure they were real anymore until I saw them laid out on a screen in front of me like evidence in a trial. I didn't know I'd been preparing for my entire life. The show was pitched as a soft exposé, a platform for untold family stories. They said, a humanizing look at the dynamics we all live through but rarely speak of, and I believed them, maybe because I wanted to, or maybe because I needed to finally believe that my voice was worth more than the silence that had wrapped itself around me for years. Camille didn't know yet. Neither did my parents. I hadn't told them. I wasn't ready. But word travels fast in our world, especially when someone from the old church group spotted me in a teaser clip shared online, especially when my last name was attached to the phrase, "Secrets behind a luxury empire." That was the match. The spark. The moment I realized the fire had already started and there was no going back. It was a Wednesday when I got the first call. My mother, her voice strained and tight, not angry yet, just confused in that way that always made me feel like a disobedient child, like I'd broken a vase in a room I wasn't supposed to enter. "Brielle," she said, "someone from the garden club just sent me something. Are you involved in a television show?" I sat in my apartment, staring out the window at the gray stretch of sky over Chicago, heart racing, breath shallow. I could lie. I could deflect. But I was so tired of lies. "Yes," I said. "I am." There was silence, sharp and immediate. "Why?" she asked finally, her voice smaller now, more fragile. "Why would you do something like this?" I wanted to scream, because you never listened when I tried to tell you in private, but instead I said, because it's my story too, and I'm tired of pretending it isn't. She didn't respond. She hung up. The next day, my father emailed Minute called, not even a text, an email, formal and clipped, as if addressing a client he was preparing to cut ties with. He wrote, "We're extremely disappointed in your decision to air personal matters publicly. You have always had a place in this family. This feels like a betrayal." That word betrayal rang in my ears for hours, because how could they call this a betrayal when they had spent years ignoring the ways they left me out, the nights I cried quietly in rooms no one entered, the celebrations they never acknowledged, the ways they chose Camille over and over without apology or explanation? But then came Camille. Not a call. Not a text. A message cold, surgical, sent to my email like she couldn't bear the intimacy of speaking directly. Subject: "You're playing with fire. Brielle, I don't know what you think you're doing, but this needs to stop. Immediately. You have no right to drag our family through the mud for your own attention. If you air anything personal or defamatory, I will pursue legal action." I'm not joking. Camille. No greeting, no warmth, no acknowledgement that I was her sister, just a warning. A threat. And in that moment, my hands shaking, my breath caught in my throat, I realized that the sister I once adored, once believed would come through for me if I just held on long enough, no longer existed. Maybe she never had. Maybe she'd always been this person. Maybe I just didn't want to see it. I didn't respond to her email. Instead, I kept filming. We shot a segment in my old hometown, standing outside the house I grew up in, now faded around the edges, the garden overgrown, the shutters still cracked, just like I remembered. I talked about the holidays where Camille opened diamond earrings and I got secondhand scarves, about the family dinners where I'd speak and be met with silence, about the birthday when no one showed up except my high school friend Ivy, who brought a single cupcake and held me while I cried. I talked about how Camille once took credit for a campaign idea I gave her, then publicly thanked her team and never mentioned my name. I showed screenshots, receipts, the truth. I didn't embellish. I didn't exaggerate. I just told it plainly, the way it happened, letting the camera catch the hurt in my voice, the tired weight behind my words. And when the first episode aired, just a teaser, just a 10-minute preview, the backlash was immediate. Not from strangers. From family. My Aunt Susan sent a message. "How could you do this to your mother?" My cousin Mark posted on Facebook. "Dirty laundry belongs in the hamper, not on national television." Even Ivy, sweet, dependable Ivy, called me with worry in her voice, asking, "Are you sure this is the right way? Are you sure it won't just make things worse?" But worse than what? I wanted to ask. Worse than being invisible? Worse than being erased? I didn't lash out. I didn't defend myself. I let the truth sit there, uncomfortable and real, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to please anyone, I was trying to survive. And sometimes, surviving means letting people hate you if it means you get to love yourself. I knew more was coming. More anger, more confrontation, more pain. But I also knew this. The silence was broken. And that sound of something shattering it was terrifying. But it also sounded a lot like freedom. Grief doesn't always arrive dressed like death. It sometimes shows up wearing your mother's perfume, or tucked into a voicemail that ends too quickly, or sitting in the silent space between your heartbeats when you realize that everything you ever hoped your family would be was just a story you told yourself to survive. And no matter how many times you rewrote it in your head, trying to give it a happy ending, the characters never changed, and the love you imagined was never really there. The day after the episode aired, I didn't get out of bed. I lay there beneath the covers, my eyes swollen from the kind of crying that doesn't come in loud sobs, but in slow, aching leaks, the kind that trickles out of you, because your body no longer knows how to hold the weight of being so thoroughly rejected by the people who were supposed to carry you when you fell. I didn't check my phone. I couldn't bear to read another message that told me I was cruel, or selfish, or dramatic, or attention-seeking. Especially not from relatives who hadn't sent me a birthday card in 6 years, but suddenly felt righteous enough to condemn me for hurting the family. And the silence from my parents was louder than anything. No calls, no texts, no flicker of defense, just absence. It felt like they had buried me. I tried to eat, but my stomach turned at the smell of toast. I tried to shower, but the water hitting my skin felt like tiny needles. I tried to distract myself with work, but the screen blurred and every word I typed felt hollow and pointless. I was unraveling, quietly, politely, the way I'd always been taught to break down. It was in that unraveling that I understood something terrifying. I wasn't just mourning the loss of my family's approval. I was mourning the hope that they would ever change. And when that hope died, something inside me collapsed too. I'd spent so many years building my worth on their validation, so many nights measuring my value against Camille's reflection, believing that if I could just be better, smarter, quieter, prettier, more successful, they'd finally love me the way they loved her. I had constructed my entire sense of identity around the idea that one day they would look at me and say, "You were enough all along." But now I knew. They never would. Not because I wasn't enough, but because they had never learned how to see me. And the grief of that realization crushed me. I remember walking into my kitchen that evening, barefoot and dazed, and staring at the fridge like it might give me a reason to keep trying. I opened it, closed it, opened it again. Empty cartons. A forgotten bottle of wine. A note I'd written to myself weeks earlier that said, "Keep going." I almost laughed at the irony. I didn't feel like I could. I sat on the cold tile floor and folded in on myself. No camera. No script. No performance. Just me, alone. With the unbearable weight of being unwanted. I thought about calling Ivy, but what would I say? That I'd started a fire I couldn't put out? That I'd told the truth and lost the only people who ever claimed to love me? That maybe Camille was right that I was embarrassing, not because of who I was, but because I dared to believe that truth mattered more than appearances? I didn't call. I just sat there, wrapped in stillness, listening to the sound of the refrigerator hum and the aching silence of a family that had chosen to look away. It's strange. The things you remember during despair, not the big moments, but the small, strange fragments. I remembered the time I broke my arm in 3rd grade, and Camille laughed because I cried in front of her friends. I remember the time I got a poem published in the local paper and my dad called it a cute hobby. I remembered the exact shade of lipstick my mom wore the day she told me, gently, that I should probably wear darker colors, they're more forgiving. I remembered how each of those moments had hurt just a little, and how I had brushed them off, one by one, convincing myself they didn't mean anything, when really, they were all warning signs of a kind of love that had rules I didn't know how to follow. By the time night fell, I was numb. I turned off the lights and curled into bed, not because I was tired, but because I didn't know where else to go. The city lights outside my window flickered against the ceiling, casting strange, shifting shadows that looked almost like hands reaching out to hold me. I wished they were, I wished someone was. But no one came. And in that darkness, I whispered something I'd never dared speak out loud. I don't think they love me. Not really. The words tasted like metal. Sharp. Final. I closed my eyes and let them settle in my chest, like stones at the bottom of a river, heavy and cold, but somehow grounding. Because the truth is, once you stop running from your loneliness and sit still enough to feel its shape, you realize it's been there all along, quiet, patient, waiting for you to stop pretending you were whole. And in that moment, I stopped pretending. I was broken. But I was still here. And even though no one clapped, no one called, no one told me I was brave, I knew I was. Because grief this deep doesn't kill you. It just becomes part of you. And in the morning, when I got out of bed, brushed my teeth, and opened my laptop to write again, I knew I hadn't lost everything. I'd lost them. But I was finding me. It's strange how clarity doesn't always come with lightning or sirens, or a voice booming from the sky. It sometimes arrives in a quiet moment, disguised as exhaustion. When you've cried yourself empty and there's nothing left to feel except a cold, lucid resolve, the kind that makes you sit up in bed at 3 a.m. and whisper to yourself, "No more," because you finally understand that surviving isn't the same as living, and silence isn't the same as peace. That moment came for me the night I opened the folder labeled Camille, Confidential. On my external drive, the one I had created out of instinct, not vengeance, over the years, filled with screenshots, emails, forwarded documents, and voice memos, little things I had stored away not because I thought I would use them, but because somewhere deep down, I had always known that one day, the truth would matter more than the illusion of loyalty. And I think part of me knew, even then, that Camille had built her empire not just on brilliance and branding, but on buried secrets and broken promises. I had the emails from a former intern who reached out to me in confidence 3 years ago, shaky, scared, detailing how Camille had taken credit for her product pitch, then fired her the day before it was presented to investors, promising her silence in exchange for a glowing reference letter that was never sent. I had a voice recording from an old friend of Camille's, Madeline, who used to be in PR before she left the industry altogether, telling me, her voice trembling, that Camille manipulated supplier deals, overstated user data and reports to potential partners, and paid influencers under the table to boost engagement stats ahead of a funding round. And then there was the NDA, an unsigned version sent accidentally to my inbox years ago, when Camille had asked me to proofread a few documents, too distracted to realize what she was giving me. It was for a settlement agreement with a woman named Lacey. I never knew what happened exactly, only that Lacey had worked closely with Camille and suddenly vanished from the company with no announcement, no farewell, no goodbye post. The NDA was aggressive $75,000 in hush money, a non-disparagement clause, threats of legal recourse. And all of it signed by Camille's legal team. Back then, I didn't know what to do with it. I told myself it wasn't my place. I wanted to believe that Camille was capable of redemption, that she wasn't as cruel as she seemed. But now? Now I saw it all clearly. This wasn't just about a sister who didn't love me. This was about someone who built her success on the backs of others, someone who weaponized charm and reputation to silence the people she stepped on. Someone who was so desperate to maintain her perfect image that she buried the truth and dared anyone to dig it up. So I started digging. I reached out to Lacey. It took 3 emails and a week of silence before she finally responded. Her message was short, simple. I've been waiting for someone to ask. Let me know when you're ready to talk. And when we did, her voice on the other end of the line shook not with fear, but with something deeper. Relief. Anger. Grief that had nowhere to go until now. She told me everything. About the toxic work culture. About Camille's verbal abuse behind closed doors. About the panic attacks. About the night Camille screamed at her in a boardroom, red-faced and cruel, then offered her the settlement the next morning like an apology she could buy her way out of. I recorded every word with permission. Because this wasn't just my fight anymore. It was all of ours. And I began to build my case not for a court, but for the public, for the people watching the show who thought it was just another dramatic sibling spat. I worked with the producers, gave them names, documents, timelines. I showed them the receipts. They were stunned. They had expected drama, yes, but they hadn't expected this. Not hard evidence. Not corporate fraud. Not a woman with a polished image built on silence and threats and a trail of people too afraid to speak. But I wasn't afraid anymore. Because when you've lost everything, you stop fearing consequences. And when you've been dismissed your entire life, the fire that builds in your chest isn't rage, it's clarity. I was no longer trying to reclaim my family. I was trying to reclaim the truth. So we filmed the 2nd episode. This time, I didn't cry. I sat in the chair, looked directly into the camera, and said, "My sister called me an embarrassment. But what's more embarrassing, being honest, or hiding everything you've built behind a lie?" I told them about Lacey. About Madeline. About the intern. I read excerpts from emails, played voice memos, showed documents Camille never thought anyone would question. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't vindictive. I was just done. Done with being quiet. Done with letting her narrative bury mine. And when the crew wrapped, when the lights dimmed and the cameras stopped rolling, I sat alone in the studio and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Power. Not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that comes from knowing that your voice, your truth finally matters. It didn't fix the pain. It didn't bring my parents back to me. But it gave me something I hadn't had since I was a child, clutching my sketchbook in the corner of Camille's ballet recitals, wishing someone would look at me and see more than an afterthought. It gave me dignity. And in this war for recognition, that was a victory I could hold. There are moments in life that split time in half before and after, and when I think about the day I stood face to face with Camille for the first time since everything aired, I know with chilling clarity that it was one of those moments, not because we screamed at each other or cried or fought like sisters in some soap opera climax, but because of how calm I felt, how unnervingly steady I was. As if the years of quiet rejection and invisible wounds had all been leading to this one point where I would finally stop begging her to see me and simply stand my ground as the woman she had underestimated one too many times. The confrontation wasn't planned, it never is, not really. I had flown back to Lexington at the producer's request to film some closing material near our childhood home, and as fate or irony or something crueler would have it, Camille was there too, arriving unexpectedly at our parents' house just a few blocks away, summoned by panic and pressure. desperate to regain control of a narrative that had slipped through her perfectly manicured fingers. She didn't knock. She just walked onto the set like she owned the ground under her feet, like the truth didn't rattle her bones the way it did everyone else. And when I saw her walking tall, poised, eyes burning with something between fury and fear, it was the first time I realized she was unraveling. She stood across from me, arms crossed, jaw tight, every inch of her still curated and composed, but her voice cracked, just slightly, when she said, "What the hell are you doing, Brielle?" And I just looked at her, not flinching, not folding, not shrinking like I had all those other times she made me feel small with a sentence. "I'm telling the truth," I said. She left a hollow, humorless sound. "This isn't truth. This is betrayal. You've humiliated me in front of the whole country." End of quote. "No," I said, "you did that yourself. I just stopped protecting your version of the story." Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I saw the panic beneath her polished surface, the storm behind her practiced stillness. "You think this makes you look strong, airing our dirty laundry like some wounded little girl crying for attention." And maybe once, those words would have gutted me. Maybe once, I would have folded into myself, apologized, tried to explain, tried to make her feel better about what I felt, but not anymore. Not this time. "I'm not crying for attention," I said, my voice low, deliberate. "I'm demanding accountability." She scoffed, turning toward the producers who stood in stunned silence nearby. "And you people, you just let her do this? You film it like it's entertainment?" One of them stepped forward, cautious, professional. "Camille, this is Brielle's story. We invited her to speak." "It's not her story." Camille snapped. "It's our family. She doesn't get to twist it." And I finally said what I had buried for years, the truth that sat lodged in my throat every time she dismissed me, every time my parents looked through me, every time I wondered why I wasn't enough. "No," I said. "It's not your family, it's our family, and I've lived in it too. You don't get to be the only narrator." "Or Tef." She turned back to me then, her eyes glassy now, her voice quieter. "You've destroyed everything I built." And something about the way she said that made the sadness rise in my chest, not because I felt guilt, but because I realized, for the first time, that she truly believed her image was more important than anyone else's reality. "You built it on lies," I said. "On NDAs and stolen credit and silenced people. You hurt people, Camille. And you made them think they had to keep it quiet because your brand was too valuable." She didn't deny it. She didn't admit it either. She just stood there, the weight of her silence heavier than any confession. "I loved you," I said softly, and that was the moment her face changed, because I meant it, and she knew I did. "I defended you when you didn't deserve it. I kept secrets that made me sick. I sat in rooms where you insulted me and smiled through it because I thought being your sister meant protecting you, no matter what." She looked away then, blinking hard. "But I won't do it anymore," I said. "Because if I stay silent, I'm just another person you've manipulated into keeping your mask intact. And I've lost too much of myself trying to be the sister you could be proud of." Boo. She was trembling now, not visibly, not dramatically, but in that way you only notice when you know someone intimately, in the way her fingers twitched slightly, the way she blinked too quickly, the way her mouth opened as if to speak but then didn't. "You think Mom and Dad will forgive you for this?" she asked finally. I took a breath. "I'm not doing this for their forgiveness. I'm doing it for mine." The room was quiet. The camera crew said nothing. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Camille looked at me one last time, and for a fleeting second, I saw something flicker across her face, not hatred, not even anger, but grief. And maybe that's what this whole story was always about, not just mine, not just hers, but a shared wound neither of us had ever been brave enough to look at together. But that day, I looked. And I didn't flinch. She left without another word. And I stood there, surrounded by silence, not broken but finally, gloriously, whole. I used to think that justice came wrapped in fire, that it would arrive loudly, unapologetically. The way I had always fantasized as a child when I imagined someone finally standing up for me in the middle of one of those quiet, cold family dinners where Camille's achievements were passed around like bread and mine were treated like crumbs scattered on the floor. But what I learned instead is that real justice often comes quietly, steadily, like water carving through stone, unstoppable, not because it's loud, but because it's relentless. The day the second full-length episode aired, the one where Lacey's voice trembled through every speaker, where documents were shown on screen with Camille's name printed in bold, where former colleagues gave anonymous interviews masked in shadows and digitized voices but filled with details so specific no one could doubt them. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like release. Within hours, social media caught fire, not the celebrity kind of fire that Camille was used to, not the curated glamour of magazine features or brand deals or influencer praise, but the raw, messy, unfiltered kind of fire that burns when the truth finally breaks through the surface and refuses to be buried again. There were hashtags. There were think pieces. There were ex-employees posting vague but pointed tweets, quotes from interviews Camille once gave about integrity and innovation, now circulating next to screenshots of the settlement offer she once tried to bury. And there I was, watching it unfold, not with glee, not with spite, but with a deep, trembling breath of something I couldn't name until much later, something close to peace. Because I hadn't just told the truth. People had finally listened. I didn't expect it to happen so quickly, how brand sponsors started pulling out, how industry journalists began questioning the numbers behind her company's explosive growth, how an investor publicly demanded an internal audit, how Camille herself released a statement so carefully worded it felt like it had been exercised from her by a team of 10 lawyers and a PR consultant with no soul. The statement read, "We are aware of recent claims made in a media appearance involving personal and professional allegations. While we take these matters seriously, we are committed to addressing them privately with respect and care. Our company remains focused on transparency and ethical practices. No denial, no apology. Just a vague distancing from the fallout she had created." And yet, for the first time in my life, Camille was being held accountable not just by me, but by the very world she had always counted on to protect her image. I got calls. From journalists, from former coworkers, even from people I didn't know, people who had followed my story, who had sisters like Camille, families like mine, invisible scars that suddenly didn't feel so invisible because someone, somewhere, had dared to say, "This happened, and it wasn't okay." Ivy called me, crying. Not because she was upset, but because she'd watched the episode alone, late at night, and she said she merely saw me for the first time. And it broke her heart to think of all the years she had watched me shrink and said nothing. All the times she accepted Camille's version of events without asking for mine. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have stood up for you." And I didn't need her to say it, but God, it felt good to hear. Even my mother, eventually, cracked. It was 2 weeks after the episode aired, and I was sitting in my apartment surrounded by unopened mail and uneaten food when her name flashed on my phone screen. I didn't answer, but she left a voicemail. Her voice was soft, uncertain, not the polished maternal calm I had grown up with, but something more hesitant, almost raw. "Brielle." I watched it. All of it. And I don't know what to say, except I didn't know. I should have asked. I should have listened. I just wanted peace. But I see now that the peace I wanted meant silence for you, and I'm sorry for that. And for the first time in years, I didn't cry from pain, I cried from the weight of being heard. I didn't respond to her right away. I needed time, because forgiveness isn't a switch you flip after one voicemail, it's a process. A long, winding path filled with sharp memories and tentative hopes, and I wanted to walk it carefully, on my terms. As for Camille, she disappeared from the public eye for a while. No more features. No more galas. No more speaking events. I saw a photo of her a month later, taken by a paparazzi outside a Manhattan restaurant, sunglasses on, head low, expression unreadable. And I didn't feel triumphant. I felt hollow. Because no part of me ever wanted to destroy her. I just wanted her to stop destroying me. And when that finally happened, when the world stopped treating her words as gospel and mine as background noise, I felt something inside me shift, not just the pain dissolving, but the power returning, like blood rushing back into a limb I didn't know had gone numb. I started sleeping better. I started laughing again. I even signed with a literary agent who reached out after seeing the show, asking if I'd be willing to write a book about everything about the sisterhood that never was, about the myth of family loyalty, about what happens when silence finally breaks. I said yes, because I had more to say. And for once, people wanted to listen. Healing doesn't arrive like a trumpet's, not triumphant or immediate or even loud. It's slow and uneven and often invisible to anyone who isn't living it from the inside out. And it took me months after everything aired, after the noise died down, after Camille went silent and the world turned its attention to newer scandals and fresher betrayals, to realize that I was no longer living under the weight of her shadow, no longer adjusting my steps to avoid her brightness, no longer waiting for love from people who didn't know how to give it unless it came with conditions and performance and silence. The city felt different to warmer somehow, even in winter, and maybe it wasn't Chicago that had changed, but me. Maybe it was that I no longer walked its streets with the heaviness of invisibility, no longer sat in my apartment wondering if my voice mattered, no longer opened my phone, dreading who had ignored me or criticized me or overlooked me again, because now when I spoke, I did it with the full strength of someone who had told the truth and survived the consequences. My work changed too, not in title or salary, not at first, but in the way people looked at me across conference tables, the way my ideas were received not just with polite nods, but with interest, the way younger women on my team started coming to me after meetings, quietly, privately, to say things like, "I saw the show. You said things I've never been able to say. Thank you." And those moments, those whispered acknowledgments, they were more powerful than any public recognition because they meant someone saw themselves in my story and they felt a little less alone. And my relationship with my parents, while not repaired in the way fairy tales pretend families always can be, started to shift slowly. Hesitantly, through small gestures that once would have meant nothing but now felt monumental. A postcard from my dad congratulating me on the book deal, a Sunday morning call from my mom just to ask how my week had been, her voice softer now, less defensive, almost curious. Like she was trying to learn me again after realizing she'd never really tried to before. We didn't talk about Camelot at first. And when we did, it wasn't dramatic, it was quiet and real and hard, with long pauses and longer silences, where my mother admitted things she never had before. Like how she thought she was keeping peace by letting Camille lead, by letting her shine, not realizing that what she was really doing was picking a favorite and pretending it was fairness. I didn't forgive her that day. But I didn't walk away either. And that felt like progress. Camille didn't reach out again, not with words, not with apologies, not even with anger, and that, more than anything, told me she still hadn't changed, still hadn't learned that silence doesn't protect power, it just delays its unraveling. And maybe one day she will reach out, maybe one day she'll look back and see not just what she lost, but what she broke. But I'm not waiting anymore. I'm not holding my breath for a version of her that might never exist. Because I have a life now, a full one, a proud one, built not around being liked or included, but around truth and connection and work that fills me instead of draining me. I spend my weekends writing and speaking and laughing with people who know the real me, not the curated version my family tolerated. I've learned that real belonging doesn't come from birthright, it comes from being loved without needing to shrink. And sometimes, late at night, when the city is quiet and I'm sitting by my window with tea in hand, I think about the little girl I used to be, the one who sat on the edge of family photos, hoping someone would pull her into the center, and I whisper to her, "You made it. You didn't disappear. You're not embarrassing. You are enough." And somehow, that feels like everything. If there's one thing I've learned from this whole journey, this long, jagged road through rejection and revelation and reluctant freedom, it's that telling the truth doesn't guarantee healing. It doesn't magically repair what's been broken. It doesn't wrap up the pain with a neat little bow, but it does something quieter and deeper. something more essential. It gives you yourself back, piece by piece, until one day you wake up and realize you are no longer asking for permission to exist. For so long I believed that my worth depended on someone else's acknowledgement, that if Camille approved of me, if my parents praised me, if strangers saw me as successful, then I could finally relax into myself without apology. But the truth is, nothing they said or didn't say ever defined who I was. It only delayed me from seeing it for myself. And once I finally peeled away all the narratives I had inherited and internalized, what was left underneath wasn't broken or embarrassing or unworthy, it was just me. Raw, honest, still healing, but finally whole. I think about that often now, especially in quiet moments, especially when I catch myself wanting to retreat into old patterns, when I draft long texts explaining my decisions, or overthink the tone of an email, or feel the urge to shrink myself so someone else can feel comfortable, and I stop, I breathe, I remind myself that I don't owe anyone an edited version of my life, that I don't have to become palatable in order to deserve love, and that my softness, my fire, my flaws, and my resilience are not contradictions. They are the truth of me. It's strange to live in a world where people now know my story, where strangers stop me on the street or message me online to say thank you, to say they saw themselves in my loneliness or my courage or my voice shaking in that second episode when I read aloud the email Camille never answered. And while some part of me is still startled by the attention, a larger part is deeply, quietly honored, because it means the pain I lived through didn't just stay pain, it became a bridge. And on the other side of that bridge, someone else feels less alone. And if that's what all of this was for, if all the nights I cried in silence, all the years I was overlooked, all the moments I almost believed I was too much or not enough, if it brought even one person closer to their own truth, to their own voice, to their own reckoning and rising, then I would go through it all again. Because there is no currency more valuable than knowing your story mattered. To anyone listening who feels like the outsider in their own family, who's been made to believe their emotions are a liability, who's tried 1,000 different ways to earn love and still come up empty, I want to tell you this. You don't have to keep bleeding for people who only love you when you're silent. You don't have to prove your worth by sacrificing your peace. You don't have to wait for permission to tell your story. You are not too emotional. You are not too difficult. You are not too much. You are exactly enough, exactly as you are. It took me 30 years to believe that, and even now, some days I forget. Some days I feel the old ache pressing against my ribs, whispering old lies with familiar voices. But then I remember the woman. I've become the one who stood in front of cameras and told the truth, not out of vengeance but out of necessity. The one who faced her sister not to destroy her but to finally stop destroying herself. The one who stopped whispering apologies and started speaking in full, unapologetic sentences, and I hold that woman close. I thank her for carrying me through. This isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about reclamation. About a woman who was called embarrassing and inconvenient and unworthy, who believed it for far too long until one day she decided to believe something else. Something stronger. Something truer. That she mattered. That she always did.